Having spent so much of the last year trying to grow this YouTube channel, posting videos talking about mixing and seeing how people respond to my videos, I've realized that people seem to be hyper-focused on completely the wrong things when it comes to mixing. It seems that so many people are obsessed with incredibly specific details about mixing, whether it's specific mix techniques or plugins that are on trend in that particular moment. It feels to me like people are looking in completely the wrong direction when they're searching for answers on why their mixes don't sound right. The truth is that great mixes have very little to do with the plugins or the gear that's being used. And a great mix is often not defined by one very specific mix technique. So today I thought I'd share 3 things that I think are often just not talked about when it comes to mixing tutorials and mix tips. I think people often overlook these for whatever reason, but for me they are crucial parts of the process. So the first thing that I do on every single mix is make sure that I understand what the feeling of the song is. What is the emotion behind the song and what's the message that the artist is trying to convey? The way that I figure this out is literally just to take a pen and paper, play the track back and write down some notes on the feelings that come to me when I hear that song. How do I interpret that as a listener of that song? Behind me is the project file I received from an artist for a mix, and my job is to go through that, tidy it up, figure out what's working, what's not working, and then eventually go on to mixing it. And in order for me to do that properly, I really have to understand where the emotion is coming from in the song. So I'll play that track back, I'll make some notes on it, and I'll really figure out where the emotion is coming from within the arrangement of the production. Sometimes it's a melodic part that's driving that. Sometimes it's maybe the feeling of a synth pad. Sometimes it's the sound of the drums. It could be a combination of all of those 3 things, but it's crucial to make sure before you begin mixing that you understand what's driving the emotion of that song. And sometimes this can be hard if you're mixing your own songs and you've been working on them for a long time. You've kind of become a bit desensitized to what the emotion of the original piece was supposed to be. But I think that's where it's really important to take a moment to reconnect with that and remember the parts that made you feel something when you first started working on it, and also be ruthless and cut out the parts that maybe don't serve that when it comes to the mix. It's rarely the case that a mix isn't working because there's not enough stuff going on in the mix. More often than not, the reason a track is not connecting is because there's too much going on. Stuff needs to be stripped out and the focus needs to be placed on those emotional triggers and the things that really drive the feeling of the song. So the very first time you hear the song, make some notes, keep referring to them, and keep checking in with yourself to make sure that you're pushing the mix in the direction that shines a light onto the feeling of the song and makes it connect with the listener emotionally. The second thing that nobody seems to talk about when it comes to mixing tutorials is sound design and sound choices. And I understand that so much of this is about production decisions, but as a mix engineer now, I think more than ever, where you're often being hired, or at least in my case, I'm often being hired by independent artists to come in and work with them on projects where they're self-funding, they've been working on a track for a long time themselves. My job is not just to come in and be a mix engineer and like add some compression and do some EQ and add some reverb and send it back. My job is to help them finish the song. I feel like a lot of people think about the stages of making a record as you write the song, you record and produce the song, you do your editing, you send it for mixing, it gets mastered, and then it's released. But I think that misses out a key part of the production process, which is the stage after production and before mixing that's not editing. It's sort of sound design and sound refinement, which often comes before editing, for me at least. So you finish the production in terms of putting your ideas down and throwing everything on the wall and seeing what works. But then you go through and you refine that and you make sure that everything in that part of the process is as good as it can be, so that when it comes to mixing, there's less work to do. And you're not asking the mix engineer to do crazy things and make big changes because everything's already figured out. You know what it is. The mix then is just about enhancing what's already there. So have you gone through your track and made sure that the sounds are as good as they can possibly be? Is it the best snare sound that you can find? Does the kick actually sit where you want it to in the track? Or does it maybe need a different kick sample? Or does it need to be worked in a different way to make it fit with the feeling of the song a bit more? Because I think a lot of people begin mixing their tracks before the production is really finished. So with this project, for example, it's a bit of a mess. I've been sent this from the artist. The track sounds great, but it's not laid out in the way that I'd want it to be. There's things in there that can be tweaked. I think there's bass sounds and stuff that are not quite right. Do the drums need a bit of work? This is all what this whole part of the process is about. Like that bass sounds okay, but I think I can get a much better, more interesting bass sound there. The kicks and the snares. It's all quite sparse at the minute, and I feel like it could just go up a level. It's not quite ready to be mixed, but the artist has reached a point where they feel like the production is done. They can't really do any more to the production. So my job is now to come in and elevate it and get it ready so that by the time I come to mixing it, it's as good as it can possibly be. And if you feel like you're working way too hard on your mixes and things are not sounding right, maybe your mix sounds cluttered, the vocal doesn't sit in the right place, more often than not, it's because you skipped that sound design or sound refinement stage, and you need to go back there and make sure that you got everything right before you start mixing. So many people get to the mixing stage and they feel like their track isn't quite finished yet, but they don't really know why. So they start mixing hoping that that's what's going to bring them results, and ultimately they just go round and round in circles in the mix. So that sound selection phase is a really good place to define when the song is finished and when it's basically ready to be mixed. And a lot of that just comes from feeling. It's the feeling of like, I actually don't really know where to go next with this. I don't really know. Sorry, I just got a message come through.
I love it. I've like written a few small comments. I know it's not a mix, but yeah, I definitely feel like it feels more aligned, and it already sounds pretty good to me, so I think it's pretty close. What do you think? I'm going to have another few listens, but yeah.
There you go. Funny enough, on the subject of knowing when a track is finished, case in point, track's ready to be mixed. It doesn't need any more doing to it. That's what that whole sound selection stage, this stage that I'm currently working on at the minute, that's what this is about, is getting the track to a point where it feels like it's ready and we don't have to spend hours on the mix because we've got the production right beforehand. So the third and final thing that I feel like is not talked about in mixing tutorials are the 4 dimensions of a mix. And this is something that I posted a video on a little while ago, but generally I feel is just completely neglected when it comes to mixing tutorials on YouTube. Because so often tutorials hyper focus on incredibly specific techniques or small sections of a song where they're working on maybe a vocal effect or how to mix the drums in this specific section of a song. But it neglects the most important thing, which is the 4th dimension of music. So music, the way I see it, has 4 dimensions. It has width in terms of left to right, so that's panning and how we use the stereo field to place things within a mix. Then we have height in terms of the frequency spectrum, so low frequency to high frequency, and how we place things in that using EQ and other sort of filtering and affecting the frequencies of a song, basically. Then we have depth, which is front to back, so volume, spatial effects, things that give the illusion something is closer or further away from the listener. And then finally we have the 4th dimension, which is time. And that time element dictates the emotion of the song, because how the mix evolves over time is what brings energy, it's what brings feeling, it's what brings interest and keeps the listener hooked to a song. So for example, if I just teach you a technique about how to make your drums sound as big and as loud as they possibly can, and you go and apply that to every song you ever do at every point in the song, and you start your track with this technique where the drums are really big and loud and it just carries on that way throughout the whole song, you're never going to create any impact by using that technique, because if everything is really loud all the time, then nothing ever feels loud. The way that you create emotion and impact and interest in a song is by manipulating things over a period of time. So hyper focusing on specific techniques and specific plugins and gear and all of that stuff is kind of useless, because the song and the mix of the song is not about a very specific thing in one moment. It's about how do things unfold. And you can use these techniques to add impact in moments of songs, but it's important, it's crucial in fact, to constantly think about your mix as a 4-dimensional art form and something that needs to constantly change. And I think back to when I was learning to mix and how I was affected by some of the advice that I would read online or whatever. And I think I would apply things like making sure my kick was as deep and as subby as it could possibly be all the time, and that the vocal was bright and up front. There's a time and a place for that, but not all the way through a track. And when you start to learn things like, actually, maybe the kick drum in this song needs low end taking away, or maybe the top end in this vocal needs to be rolled off, and we need to make the vocal super dark so that when the chorus hits, everything feels really bright and energetic, or when the kick drum hits, in the chorus, that's when we add the low end back in, because that's when you want the thump. You don't necessarily have to have it throughout the whole song. I feel like those kind of things are so often left out of mixing tutorials, is the context of how does this work over the course of a 3 or 4 minute song, or maybe longer, maybe shorter, depending on the kind of music you make. So try to think about your music as a 4-dimensional thing, kind of like a movie would. You know, how does a movie evolve over time? And apply the previous 2 points to that as well. So how does the emotion of the song change over time? Those feelings that I mentioned writing down at the beginning, what can you apply to certain scenes within your song to enhance the mood? What is the mood of that scene? And how can you use all the techniques that you know to enhance that mood? And then moving on to the point about sound design, this is even more important in a 4-dimensional context. So yeah, you got this snare sound in the verse, but does it work in the chorus? Do all of the parts in the song serve the dynamic curve of the song? Do I need to take something away in this part of the song to make this part of the song more impactful? These are things that I try to consider all the time. And I feel like that's what makes mixes impactful and emotional and interesting, is applying all of these things over a period of time in a 4-dimensional context. And I actually wrote a kind of ebook about this, which is basically just a little free short guide that talks a bit more about this concept and how I perceive it, because I think it's so important, and I think it's sort of what underpins all the greatest mixes of all time. And if you can nail that 4-dimensional mixing mindset, then I really think it transforms your mixes. And certainly for me, when I started to think about music in that way and started to think about my mixes in that way, that's when I noticed the biggest improvement in terms of mixes that sounded interesting and exciting, and ultimately mixes which connected with the listener. So to summarize this video, the 3 things that I make sure I've got nailed on every single mix that have nothing to do with plugins or gear or super specific mix techniques are: make sure that you understand the emotion of the song and you know how to apply that in the mix. Make sure that the sound design and sound choices are as good as they can possibly be. And then finally, make sure that you're manipulating those things over a period of time throughout the song to continuously enhance the emotion and bring as much feeling and as much energy to a mix as possible. And if you're interested in understanding more about this 4-dimensional mixing concept, you can get the free e-guide right now. As I said, it's totally free, it doesn't cost a penny. You can download it on the link in the description below. And as I said, I also posted a video on this a little while ago, which you can check out right now here if you're interested.